All right, welcome back here on stage one, the final panel of the day at Running Remote. Should most remote work be asynchronous? This panel, sponsored by Loom. Joining us remotely, we'll bring her in momentarily, if I can say that at the end of the day, is Julia, the head of product marketing at Loom. Leading the panel, the stage two MC, Daphnee Laforest, the founder of Modern Leaders. Come on out. Come on out, everybody. Daphnee has been leading on stage two. I'm sure you know Daphnee well. Also, Ryan Burke, the CRO from Qatalog. Sam, we know you quite well. And who's this guy? Oh, it's the Harry Potter guy. No, and Nathan Barry from ConvertKit. Daphnee, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hey, everyone. Really nice event I think everyone had today. It's really nice to see everybody's face for so much time we've been away from each other, and now we can finally meet in person. So let's get going. So actually, since the past 2 years, we've seen many companies kind of experiencing asynchronous work for the first time. It was a bit of the main topic everybody was talking about. But I don't think many people actually know what great async is, and I really want to get everyone opinions about that today, but also talk about the pros and cons of it and where it's actually a good idea to go async and when it's not a good idea to go async. So what's interesting that we have today is we have panelists coming from very different companies. So we have Julia from Loom with a company of about 150 employees joining us remotely. We have Ryan Burke from Qatalog, about 50 employees. We have Nathan from ConvertKit we were talking earlier with another company about 70 employees. And then we have a bigger company. We have Samantha Fisher from Okta with 5,000 employees. So it's very interesting to see that concept that's going to be like different depending on what kind of company it is. So let's kickstart the conversation. I want to start with Julia. So if you can hear me well, please raise your hand, show me that you're hearing me. So Julia, why do you think that async is now the go-to method in remote work?
Yeah, for sure. Hi, everyone. Good to be here. I think there's really a few things that are going on here. I think pandemic aside, the proliferation of tech tools has resulted in several things that have led to a desire to work asynchronously. So I think, through tech tooling, we have the rise of distributed teams. We can actually get more done faster than in the past. So we're actually doing more as knowledge workers. I think we're more distracted than ever and craving focus time. And somehow meetings have taken over our calendars. So I think people are looking for smarter ways to work. And then, of course, the pandemic exacerbated all of the above. And then I think the third thing that comes to mind for me is, at least in technology, engineering culture is really spilling over into other departments. And engineers have for a long time touted the benefits of the flow state and focus time in getting work done as an ideal way to work. And who says that a marketer or an ops person doesn't need focus time as well? So I think people are just looking for smarter ways to work now.
Right, yes. And I'd love to have an idea a bit more about all of you. What kind of system did you put in place to create an asynchronous way of work in your own organization? Let's start with Nathan.
Yeah, we're pretty big on asynchronous work. Probably the only thing that we don't do asynchronously is anything involving conflict. We really like to encourage, if you see conflict start to building, we're like, please take that to a live, synchronous, as much of a Zoom call or something else as possible. But the systems that we rely on, we use Basecamp for posting messages and having those conversations. And we really just lean on a lot of long-form writing. We also, another thing that we do is encourage people to, write plans in advance of the meeting. And we'll do, I think this is from Amazon, but spend the first 10 minutes of a meeting reading a plan that someone wrote in advance to get that context. One of my least favorite things to do is someone presenting information or reading information to me. It's just give it to me and let me read it. I'll read it much faster, retain it better, and ask questions. So we're really, just leaning on long form written communication in advance and then structuring our meetings around that when we do have them.
Right, and you, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things. One, at Qatalog, 50-person organization, we've been pretty intentional around sort of defining how we work. And I think you mentioned, Nathan, just even something as simple as the conflict. Like, that's a downside, or that's at risk sometimes of asynchronous, because you can't necessarily portray tone. Somebody leaves a note in a document, like, what the hell did they mean by that? And so being very prescriptive in terms of how you're going to handle things like that, making sure you're adding additional context, you're getting on a Zoom call to clear something up. And prior to Qatalog, I worked at Envision, where we scaled to 900 fully remote employees, prior to COVID. And similarly, we had a lot of SLAs, in terms of defining what types of vehicles you were going to use for what types of communication or documentation. Emails for this, Slack for this, Google Docs, whatever it was, but being very prescriptive. Because the last point I'll make, you said at the beginning, do people know what asynchronous looks like? I'm not sure a lot of people even know what asynchronous means. And I think you just have to define that for your company and then provide the frameworks.
Yes, definitely agree with that. How do you define that? At Okta, is a company that is so big, and people don't think that actually this is something that could work in a enterprise company? Let us know a bit more about that.
Yeah, so we don't do it well. That's me being a little bit vulnerable after being on a panel like two panels ago. And part of that is because we're transitioning to that. That's not something that we do well as an organization. We are defining what that looks like for us. A little bit to what Ryan said was, what do you use different types of communication for? What do you use Slack for? What do you use email for? What do you use Zoom for? We are still primarily an synchronous organization. There's a lot of synchronous work, and it was a little bit like when the pandemic started, every meeting that you used to have in person just became a Zoom meeting. And so we're working our way through that to get people comfortable with doing asynchronous work. I would say right now our primary tools are Slack. We use Slack a lot. There's a lot of kind of tips and tricks that we put out to the organization around how to use Slack to do that. We also, we're a Google shop, so we use Google Workspace. I will say, we're really good about collaborating and sharing documentation very broadly, and all up and down the food chain, from most senior people to the more junior folks, so that people can provide feedback on it and give feedback into that. We're working through the process of everybody getting comfortable putting agendas in meeting invites before they start, and some of those just behavioral changes as we make that transition from an in-person culture where, again, somebody might have handed you a deck, they didn't read it to you, but you were already flipping, you were 3 pages ahead when they started talking. We're working through those things. But for us, a lot of that async has more to do with being cognizant of the fact that we have a globally distributed workforce. And so we really try to use async to support teams that are not in our geography or in our time zone, to make sure they feel like they are inclusive and they get content and can comment on the content before decisions are made.
Right, I'd like to debate the point of Slack usage in asynchronous work, because to me, Slack is a bit more representing the instant messaging culture we have of like texting and back and forth. So I don't feel like this is something people can actually use as an async method. So what else would you use necessarily outside of Slack, for example, to stay asynchronous? Maybe Julia could share a bit more, like, what are different strategy to communicate without using instant messaging apps?
Yeah, this is a tough one. We also use Slack. We don't actually use email at all internally at Loom, just for external conversations with customers or vendors. We use a wiki called Notion, which is also kind of our documentation platform. So I think, we use Slack as our primary channel of communication, but we link to lots of asynchronous documentation. So whether that is a Notion document with a plan for a project, or some thinking around a decision that was made. And of course, we use our own tool, Loom, as well, to kind of add a little bit of context or color to a conversation that actually can happen asynchronously in Slack. Yeah, we've kind of created a culture around you don't have to respond instantly to kind of a threaded conversation that obviously is going a little deeper than just instant messaging where you need to respond quickly.
Yeah, and I don't mean that we don't use Slack. I think we all use Slack. Like everybody's using Slack every day. It's more like people are kind of trying to get out of it and then try to optimize their way of work. So I'd love to know also a bit, Ryan, if you have anything to add with
Yeah,
that.
I just think she made a great point about the cultural expectation that you don't have to respond. Because with the shift, the force shift, remote first versus remote force, I like that. You know, a lot of companies, there's been an explosion of tools. And they're supposed to optimize the ability to communicate and collaborate. And it's actually had the negative effect. You're just getting the pings constantly of Slack or whatever it is. And so, to Julia's point, I think you have to, as a company, make sure you make that cultural shift that there's not an expectation of digital presenteeism. It's okay to respond later. And I think that's probably the biggest, the biggest thing in relative to moving to asynchronous way of working is that cultural shift, setting the example from leadership, leading from the front. And so regardless whether it's Slack or all of the other tools that exist today, people are so inundated with these different pings and these different messages, you have to change the cultural expectation that it's okay not to respond immediately.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And there's two ways that we found to do it. One is we have a shorthand. If someone types out Command Q, that means in the company, I'm quitting Slack to go do focused work. So like, I'm working, like I just hit Command Q on my computer, Slack's gone, I'm focused and working. The second thing is if you communicate intent on what any decisions or the conversation that you're trying to have, then that'll let people know, like be okay with it going by, hey, we're just brainstorming things here. We're not about to make a decision. Because if you're saying, hey, quit Slack, do focused work, and then at the same time you're over here, like, starting a conversation, working through it, making a decision with whoever's online, and then moving on implement, and someone comes back from their focused work, which you told them to do, and they come back and like, you made the,
Right.
You're undermining the thing that you're trying to communicate. So you have to be really clear of like, okay, cool. We brainstormed this thing in Slack with whoever was live. Someone's going to write up the plan, and there will be time for those who are doing focused work or in a different time zone to weigh in later. Kind of the last thing that we've done well is implement unless I hear differently. So if you hear someone, or if you see someone type out UIHD, unless I hear differently, they're just saying, unless I hear differently, this is what I'm going to implement. So they're giving people time to say, like, to weigh in, hey, here's the contract I'm going to send to the customer at 5 p.m. today, unless I hear differently. And that way you can know, oh, okay, I can just let that go by, because that sounds good, good plan. Or you can be like, oh, no, like here's this context that you didn't have. And so just communicate your intent in your asynchronous messages. It makes a big difference.
Awesome. And Samantha, I know a bit of your views on this just personally, but what do you think is the right balance of async work? When do you think it is actually not right to work asynchronously?
I think it, depends on the company and the organization and to some degree where you are in this, but I think there are certain conversations that are not good asynchronous. Obviously, anything having to do with performance or coaching, or I think sometimes even mentoring. Definitely anything that has an opportunity to be misconstrued because you're giving constructive feedback, right? Particularly in a one-on-one setting, whether that's with a direct report, whether you're managing up, whatever that looks like. I think that that's a challenging way to do it if you're doing asynchronous communication. It's funny, I was just having this conversation with Stephanie and Chase from the previous panel, and we were talking about the challenges of async, and particularly in big organizations. I really love, Nathan, what you talked about around the thing that we struggle with is time. So everything, and I think async sometimes, if your organization is very focused on execution and delivery and urgency, sometimes async can feel slow, right? It can also feel like it interrupts your creativity flow. It's not to say that it does, because Chase was just talking about something that they took a week to work on. But if any of you guys were here when Stephanie talked about, what's the fire that you can keep let it keep burning. If you have 17 fires, you can't let all of them burn. And so sometimes I think you have to determine, I can do this async, but it's going to take me 2 days or 3 days or potentially, longer to get the answer and the decision on it. So I think it just depends on what it is you're trying to solve for. And I really like, Nathan, your point around giving people intent to say, this is what you need. This is what I need you to do, or I'm going to move forward with a decision. Because I do think that's maybe in larger organizations, that's a bit of the paralyzer, is you start an async conversation, you put something out there in the ethos, and you're like, what do you think? That's such an open-ended way to end a conversation. Or you send somebody a document and they're like, all right, give me your feedback. Okay. So I think there's definitely, again, the word intentionality around it. And then I think it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And I think you also need to know your audience. There are a lot of people that I don't care what we tell them, they will not communicate well async. It's hard for them to do that. It's a little bit like a learning style. Everybody learns differently. So everybody communicates differently. And so I think part of your job as an async communicator is to know, is this going to be relevant and resonate with the person who I'm talking to get the outcome that I'm trying to achieve?
Yes, and if we stay in that kind of painful aspect of asynchronous, when we worked remotely for many years, when you work asynchronously, there's a lot of written words, there's a lot of content to read. It can actually become quite overwhelming, not being able to, have feedback quickly from someone, as you were saying. I'd love to hear a bit more of stories or something where you can share what is painful in async work that should be improved. Someone, maybe Julia, wants to start if you have something in mind.
Sure, yeah, I think if you think about asynchronous work and where it can be improved or where are the pain points, I would say it's really hard to do if everyone is not bought in. So one of the things that we've implemented at Loom is a no meeting Wednesday to really give people the room to have focus time and work asynchronously. And so that was our step in kind of leveling the playing field, that on Wednesdays, everyone is working asynchronously. But when people start putting meetings on your calendar, it becomes really hard to do. So I think it all comes back to culture and really having everyone be on the same page around having the intent to work asynchronously, because we believe that there are benefits here. So I think unless everyone's bought in, it doesn't really work that well.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I feel like, especially as the company scales, when Envision we're going through sort of a rapid growth phase, different parts of the organization had different ways to, run their departments asynchronously. And documentation was one thing, but separating documentation from communication. Because, for instance, our, one of our old CTOs, he did a really good job of doing these blogs every month or every few weeks that were consumable to the rest of the organization. Because if they were just documenting everything, that wasn't always helpful. It was sort of documenting, making sure things are up to date, but then communicating things more broadly to the organization in a way that everybody can consume it. And so I do feel like people sometimes think, async, it's all about just documentation. We've got everything up to date, but they're not communicating it out to the rest of the organization in the right way. Or it comes with, probably one of the other bigger pitfalls is just in the whole concept of change management. Documentation, async, all right, we just launched this new program. Right, but you're not giving people the context around what went into that decision, who was involved, what else was prioritized, what were the trade-offs, like always just doubling down and articulating the why. Before you send out any, documentation or any communication on a new decision, you've got to really think about the person on the other end and how they're going to be able to interpret that and understand the why that went into that decision.
Excellent. Do you have anything to add, Nathan?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what you said about, I was imagining it as the fire hose of information that comes, and I feel like it's a problem at our 70-person organization. I couldn't imagine how it would be with thousands of people. Because before you didn't know that this little conversation was happening, or that this team over here decided this, and maybe you'd have input, but like it kind of doesn't matter, it was fine. And now you can just like look over and be like, oh, what'd you decide? Oh, let me read all of this. Let me watch your videos. Let me, you can dive into any amount. And it's completely overwhelming. And so we've done a couple things. One, the focused, no meeting days. That helps a lot. We've also really encouraged people to turn off all notifications and set their own cadence for how they're going to interact with the asynchronous content, right? So instead of seeing, oh, there's a new Google Doc out or new something in Notion or Basecamp, I need to read it now. Instead we say, hey, why don't you take 20 minutes a day and engage with that longer form discussion, 30 minutes a day, and really set aside good quality time to read it and engage with it and have that be the only thing that you do. Like turn off Slack during that time. And just don't feel the need to engage in real time, and that helps. And then if we're going to have a discussion about something, really blocking off those first few minutes of the meeting and say, hey, I know half of you have read it, or some of you have skimmed it, but we're going to dive in and talk about the plan. We're going to read the plan, read the post, and then it'll all be fresh. The worst is when someone knows they were supposed to read something, but they haven't, so they skimmed it while they were like running to the bathroom before the meeting, and then they're going to spend the next 60 minutes pretending that they read it. Like that is a disaster of a meeting. And so if you just say, hey, we're all busy, we're going to take 10 minutes and read this. And kind of the last thing I'd say is being really clear on what type of meeting. Like not all meetings are the same. So if you say this is a ratification meeting, right? Someone has put together a plan, we are tweaking the plan, and then we're going to ratify and implement it. Versus this is a brainstorm meeting. You can come in cold, or this is the research we want you to do in advance. And it sets expectations and changes it. The worst is when people think they're showing up to a brainstorm meeting and they're actually showing up to a ratification meeting and they should have read things in advance, they didn't. So basically, if you have the systems around how asynchronous content is created, you need to also have systems around how that content is supposed to be consumed.
Also, I'm wondering, what do you think work would look like if it was completely asynchronous without in-person meeting? Loom is a video sharing platform where you can actually, record yourself, send your video. We don't even have to get on a meeting. We can actually go through written communication, collaborate on platforms such as Mural, any other GitLab, things like that. What would it look like? Do you think it's actually doable to work fully asynchronously? Do you have any opinions? Maybe Ryan?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't like it, but I think it's doable. We had an offsite at Envision once where, we were 900 people fully remote, so we did do an offsite, and there were 2 people in there that had worked together for 6 years that had never met in person. But they had a great relationship. I gave a big hug, and so, do I think you could go fully asynchronous? I think there's enough vehicles through, Zoom and Loom and all of these other things. Like, think about the people that you've interacted with here today. Like, we've never met in person, and, we've, Chase and some other folks that I know sort of through the community. I don't think it's probably optimal, but I do think it's achievable.
Sam?
I'm probably in the same camp with Ryan. I come from a humanities background, and so I think people in general crave interaction of some kind. I know for me personally, my creativity definitely gets stifled when I do too much work asynchronous. I run out of brain capacity because I'm constantly documenting or building, and then I feed off of other people's ideas. Like it spawns other ideas in me. And I don't get the same energy from that if I'm doing it async as I do if I'm having a face-to-face conversation with someone. Part of it is because I like to be around people. I like reading body language. I like, there's so many other cues I think that happen when you are having some kind of communication or engagement that's synchronous. I'm with Ryan. Do I think it's possible? Yes. Do I think it's optimal? No.
Nathan?
Yeah, I'm probably in a similar camp. It's obviously a spectrum, between fully synchronous work and fully asynchronous work, and I think either extreme isn't good. There's companies like Basecamp and Doist that are much more on I don't know where to put them, 90% asynchronous, maybe more. I think that's too far for us. I would end up, going more to meetings, but I also think we're at a point where I'd like to lean a little more async than we are, I want to, we're 2 days a week, no meetings. I kind of want to add another afternoon or something in there. Is this really necessary? I do like to go through and kill everyone's recurring meetings once a quarter and just say, yeah, we deleted everything. If it's worthwhile, add it back in. Just have that blank slate. What are you showing up to that is just there because it's been there every Wednesday forever. And then the other thing is, within synchronous or asynchronous, you can go different levels of fidelity, right? I'm a writer. I'm used to writing. I'm pretty good at it. And so that's natural for me, but other people don't like that. And so Loom can be a really great option. I personally love it. If you send me a Loom, I'm putting that thing at 1.5 to 2x speed, and I love it. And I can hit pause and go back. So you can create on your schedule. I can consume it on my schedule and my speed. And I think that's really good. So I think just playing with that within your team, and then just know that whatever's right for you, like someone might be like, oh, I never want to talk to people. And someone else might be like, I need human connection to feel like my work actually matters. And so you, as like an executive, you're going to be like, this is the way it should be. And some team members are going to be like, hell yes. And others will be like, if it's that way, I'm going to find another job because this doesn't connect with me. It's just going to be different for everyone.
I think a lot of the conversations that we've had today, it's about not being binary, right? And before the pandemic, we were binary, right? Only 3%, I think I said this earlier, only 3% of the US workforce had a remote option. So, and I think that's also why we feel very strongly about having a hybrid environment, because every person is different. We're not a bunch of robots, even though sometimes somebody might think that, but we're not. And everybody's learning abilities, their consuming abilities, their writing abilities, everything is different. And so while it makes it harder, there's no doubt that it's harder to manage multiple scenarios and multiple options. I think you have to consider that to really be successful at scale. For smaller companies, it might be a little bit easier, but definitely at scale. You can look at all the big companies and they're struggling. They're all struggling with how do they do either return to office or not return to office or hybrid or whatever. And it's the same conversation around async. So.
Thank you. So we're already out of time, but I really want to make sure that all of you online or live today can ask questions to the panel. So please open Slido. You can go at slido.com or sli.do on your browser and put RR22 and ask question there for our panel here. So I will start with the first question already coming in. So, is all your documentation in English? And if so, are there practices, training you put into place to help non-native English speakers with documentation and async? That's such a great question. I'm not an English-speaking person, native English-speaking. So how do you handle that in a very highly written world? Anyone wants to tackle it first?
So we're implementing, and it might sound really old school, but we really needed a front door to our organization. So we're implementing a modern day intranet, and it actually has native speaking capabilities. It was one of the primary requirements that we chose when we chose it. We use Confluence today. It does not work. And so we chose a platform that does native translation. So even if we write it in English, it can be translated into 10 or 12 other different languages. And so what that will do for folks is when they go to find content that's on that or through an enterprise federated search, it will turn that content into the native language speaking of whatever it is that they've set their profile up as. So it's one of the ways that we're trying to address the multicultural and globally distributed workforce.
Awesome. And what about smaller companies?
Yeah, I was going to say, we have a globally distributed team, but we are 70% in North America. Mm-hmm. And then everyone in the company, may not be native English speakers, but they're very strong English speakers. So we're not at the size yet, where we've opened up offices in countries that are, predominantly other languages.
You want to add something, Julia or Ryan? Julia,
I would say we're similar in the stage and that we're predominantly English. But I think the other point that this question kind of gets to is making sure the information's in a consumable format to help them feel like they belong. And so I think the language is definitely incredibly important, but also the accuracy and recency. There's nothing worse than somebody who's working remotely that doesn't know who to go to and the information they're trying to get is out of date. And so I think it's really important if you are going to move to an async, type model, that you are very deliberate about making sure that you're transparent with the information and it's up to date and it's being managed.
Awesome. Do you want to add something, Julia? Or we can go to another question. All good? So
yeah, all good.
You'll go or you're all good? All good. Perfect. Awesome. So if you have more questions, please add them. You can go on Slido. I have another one coming. 2, 3, 4. Okay, perfect. Oh, it's all coming in. Okay. So apart from written documentation, how do you build culture asynchronously? We just had a really good talk also from Nathan. So is there someone, Julia, actually, we didn't hear from you. I'd love to hear from Julia.
Yeah, sure. I would say without talking all about Loom, for this one, I think, team rituals and you have to over communicate in a way in an asynchronous culture. I know that sounds counterintuitive to the fact that there's already a lot of noise, but you have to be more deliberate about sharing your culture. It's less innate and it has to be more explicit. So we, for example, we create fun internal looms. An example is we all did a garden tour of our either plants inside our apartments, or if we're lucky enough to have a garden, we recorded that and sort of it went viral internally where everyone started sharing their plant videos. So I think you just have to be more deliberate about it and proactive than you might be in an office setting where it comes kind of a little bit more implicitly.
Awesome. And I have another question here. How do you brainstorm in async? Or do you prefer to do that live?
Yeah, I mean, I think one, people typically say, hey, with asynchronous, working, you sort of lose the water cooler moments or whatever. And, maybe you do in some cases, but, I think there are opportunities and there's tools out there that help you sort of stimulate brainstorming. Something, sort of simple at Envision is we just had a safe word that was called bad version. And so it was sort of like, hey, I haven't thought this through very well. But bad version is because when you're putting something down in writing, you're like, I got to be really thoughtful and I want to make sure that this is accurate. But if you put bad version in the document, it's like, hey, I don't know what the answer is, but bad version, what if we tried boom? And it was just, again, it was one of those safe words or those permission slips that allowed people to, throw out ideas that weren't fully baked. And that became ingrained in the culture and sort of stimulated a lot more idea sharing.
Awesome. We have more questions and not much time, so I'll continue with another one. So do you have a regular meeting? Do you have a regular meeting rhythm in addition to async work? What does that cadence look like, and how to get the most of these meetings? I guess they want to talk about meetings more around async work.
I'd say every Monday we have a state of the business meeting, which is with our managers and above. And so everyone spends 15 minutes before the meeting, 20 minutes writing out what's going on in their area of the business, updating their key metrics. We spend the first bit of the meeting, say the first 10, 15 minutes, reading that doc, commenting on it, calling things up to discussion points, and then talking about it live. And that's been a good cadence for us. The whole meeting lasts maybe 30 minutes, 45 if we have a lot to talk about. And it's just a nice pulse. And we found this balance between synchronous and asynchronous, where if someone wants to read along later, they'll get 90% of the value of being there live. And so we have this document. One of the hardest things, especially if you schedule all your video calls back to back, is you finish a meeting and someone still has to write up all the action items and the takeaways and publish that for everyone else. And if you do 4 of these, then you get to the end of your day and you're like, wow, I'm so far behind. Mm-hmm. And so I like this format of working live in a doc together, or people writing in advance and then reviewing it, because you're 90% of the way to your byproduct that you share with the company later.
Awesome. We will take one last question because it's quite important. In different countries, same words, phrases mean different things in different regions. Totally harmless comments are misconstrued as being rude. What do you do when you're in written communication? Does that happen to you? It happened to me definitely in the past. What do you do with this? Do you have anything you'd like? Somebody want to take it?
I just say we try to build a culture where people ask questions. Hey, did you mean this? Because this is how it came across. And the more context you have, the more you're like, I'm pretty sure that they didn't mean to insult me that way. I actually know this person. We also have a value in the company of default to generosity. And we use that across the company, right? If someone's like, hey, should we refund this customer or not, right? Just default to generosity. And it also goes in reading communication, where if I'm reading this, like, I have this idea, I'm reading your response that you're bashing on my idea, and I'm like about to respond, and and then I'm like, okay, maybe this is the time to move from asynchronous to synchronous. But also I'm like, what's the generous interpretation of what you're saying? Like if I read this with an angry tone, that's what I was doing by default. But what if I read this with the interpreting your intent as like generous and sharing, you're trying to build on my idea. Like if I choose that interpretation, then how would I receive it? Because as you mentioned earlier, the tone's not there. And so it's just a generous interpretation goes a long ways.
Awesome. Well, we're already out of time. It's been a short panel, but thank you so much, Julia, Nathan, Sam, and Ryan for joining the panel. And we're done for the day, everyone. It's time to party. And Danny is going to come back to give you some more guidance. Thank you, everyone.
Wow. Day one in the books. I don't have anything profound to say, unfortunately. Just a huge thanks to that panel and just incredible wisdom from that group. I just have a couple of announcements, hence the note card. By the way, thanks to Loom for sponsoring that as well. I think we use Loom a ton. Is anybody seeing Loom as it's becoming like a verb? It's like I'm Ubering. I'm just looming you. And when your brand becomes a verb, that says a lot for how you're growing. So thanks to Loom, by the way. Okay, networking and drinks is going to start downstairs momentarily. That's great news. We'll see you tomorrow, okay? 8:50 a.m. start, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Nobody stay out too late tonight, like I normally would. But no, we'll be back at it a full day tomorrow again, a really incredible slate, and then tomorrow night an after party. I want to give did I see the Multiplier crew? Where are they? Did I see them down here? A huge thanks to our platinum sponsor, Multiplier. Sagar Katari for his keynote this morning was super interesting, and we really appreciate what they've done. Also our gold sponsors, Juno. It was such a pleasure to hear from CEO this morning, from Ali. And of course, Staff Virtual, we got an engagement on stage. I mean, that is just a whole other level, and we can't wait to celebrate with the engaged couple tonight. That was something I never thought I would say at a Running Remote conference, honestly. Speaking of Running Remote, everyone, there's a remote audience here tuning in as well. Hundreds, I think thousands around the world watch today. So huge thanks to Tyler Selhorn. Tyler, if you're out there, we know you did an amazing job running the remote sessions, and thanks to everybody for tuning in virtually. Day one of Running Remote in the books. In Spain, like we say, hasta mañana, but actually, I'll see you at the bar first, okay? Thanks, everyone. Take care.